Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We are just waiting for some more participants to join, and then we will kick off in a few minutes. Thank you. So good afternoon. Thanks everyone for joining us today. So my name is Tasneem Abderrahim. I am an analyst at the North African Sahel Observatory for the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. I am happy to welcome you today to our event entitled The Human Smuggling in Libya, Niger and Chad, Evolution Amid Conflict and Political Turmoil. Now, this event is based on a multi-country series of publications on human smuggling and trafficking ecosystems in North Africa and the Sahel. These publications cover changing dynamics in relation to human smuggling and trafficking in all of Libya, Tunisia, Morocco, Niger, Chad, and Mali, as well as political and security dynamics that affected and influenced the irregular transport of migrants. This event today will specifically present the main findings of the research reports focusing on Libya, Niger, and Chad, and which cover shifts in irregular migratory flows converging in the central Mediterranean in the year 2022. So let me introduce you to our speakers. So we have with us today Mark Micallef, who is director of the North African Sahel Observatory at the Global Initiative, and he is going to cover Libya. Then after Mark speaks, Alice Faraday, who is senior analyst at the Global Initiative, will talk to us about dynamics in Niger and Chad. Before I hand over to Mark, I just want to remind everyone that you can leave your questions and comments in the Q&A window below, and our speakers will be able to answer your questions after the presentations. So without further ado, Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tasneem. And thank you everyone for joining us. Good afternoon. I will go briefly and do a bit of an outline of our work and then dive straight into Libya before my colleague Alice Faraday will then probe Niger and Chad. So our work in these regions is predicated on a regular data collection by a team of analysts who parse open source material and conduct fieldwork, as well as extensive network of monitors that we harness on a month-to-month basis and which are spread across the countries that we work in. These comprise local journalists, researchers, academics, and in collecting information from the field, they rely on their own contacts as well as field trips. The goal of this research methodology is to develop a dynamic, moving picture of how major criminal markets and players evolve over time, allowing us to react to unfolding events and place them in their context rather rapidly. So the following represents some of the highlights of our recently published work in the field of human smuggling and trafficking, covering 2022. Today, as I said, we will focus on Libya, Niger, and Chad. However, we have also published work on Tunisia, on Morocco, as well as Mali, and in the coming future, we will be working also on Sudan. Should you be interested in receiving our reports or future events, please write to us. So, as a general overview, can I please have the slide, Claudia, please? Thank you. Next slide. Bear with me 1 second, because that's taken off my notes. Bear with me 1 minute. I can't see my notes as a result. Okay. So in the post-COVID era, human smuggling and trafficking have entered a new phase in North Africa and the North African Sahel regions. Broadly speaking, since 2020, we have seen a rapid increase in activity driven by a series of factors that include both growing political stability in some areas, as well as instability in others, economic stress, as well as strategic positioning by criminal actors and armed groups around the regular migration and the exploitation of migrants for profit. In crude numbers, please, the graph showing departures from Libya, we've seen departures leap from 29,000 in 2020 to 60,000, just over 60,000 in 2021, just over 80,000 in 2022. And to date, in 2023, we've seen the figure of 62,000 departures. Note, I'm referring to departures. So that is not just the sum of arrivals in Europe, but also incorporates the number of migrants who would have been intercepted and brought back to Libya in this case, as well as migrants who would have perished in accidents and disasters. The bird's eye view presented, however, masks a very significant distinctions and challenges presented by different countries that form part of these two major regions. I'm going to focus on Libya, from both an organized crime and stability perspective. Libya is typically the most challenging country under review, although the wider region has deteriorated in general in 2023 in terms of stability, and Tunisia has taken over Libya as an embarkation hub for Europe. In Libya, we have seen a steady increase in activity since 2020. In fact, the summer of 2022, between the months of May and September, was the busiest in terms of departures from the Libyan coast since 2017. There were more than 48,000 recorded departures in just 5 months, 18,000 more than the departures recorded for the same period in 2021. In this year, this has slowed down and partially reversed, with recent summer only recording 32,000 departures. I will touch on the reasons for this later, and we can also go through it in the Q&A. The headline explanation in gist rests on 3 primary factors. The first is that following the end of the war for Tripoli in the second half of 2020, there was a peace dividend and mobility became far easier than at any point since the start of the war in April 2019. Moreover, COVID-19 restrictions only had a very temporary effect. The second reason is that at the same time, authorities in Libya all but abandoned the politics of law enforcement that had been pushed until around 2019 and 2020, and which was responsible for the collapse of human smuggling in Libya in 2017. The third factor is that in 2022, human smuggling surged in Libya's east coast, particularly around Tobruk, with an estimated 25% of all departures taking place from this region. This share continued to grow well into the first half of 2023 before then collapsing. Again, I'll talk a little bit more about this later, and happy to discuss it further in Q&A. This reflected the resurgence of previously dominant networks within territory controlled by the Libyan Arab Armed Forces, which effectively gave a green light to this activity. Obviously, the reality is a bit more complicated than this, and I will try to go in some more detail without getting too much in the weeds due to time constraints. The clearest summary, however, of what I'm trying to present is that dynamics of human smuggling in Libya have evolved since the end of 2020 up to the end of 2022 in an environment where there was easier mobility in Western Libya, coupled with an accommodating approach in both the west and the east of the country. These created the conditions for a revival of integrated human smuggling and trafficking networks that are able to transport, accommodate, embark larger number of migrants than was possible in the previous period, 2018 to 2020. Specifically, these networks are offering a hybrid of regular and irregular migration travel services to migrants. And this has been a key driver and continues to be a driver in the landscape of irregular migration in Libya. I'll go into more detail on the phenomenon of hybrid migration further on. Before doing that, and again, without going too deep into the weeds, I think it's important to go over some recent historical events, starting with the collapse of human smuggling and trafficking in 2017. Departures then dropped from a height of 180,000 migrants to about 120,000 within the span of a year, and then kept climbing down to the low 10,000s after 2018. Essentially, this was the result of the co-option of militias by the then government of National Accord into the state apparatus. What I mean by co-option of militias, or put another way, the capture of the state by militias, is nothing new. However, in respect of human smuggling and trafficking in 2017, it's important to note that this process was particularly potent for two complementary reasons. There was a widespread scramble for legitimacy by militias, and human smuggling had become particularly toxic for this legitimacy, in part because the international community had started ramping up pressure, including with the sanctioning of human smugglers in Libya, and in part because the press and the international narrative had really placed a spotlight on the situation in Libya. So as militias sought to launder their reputations by going from smuggling outfits to sheriffs, in some cases overnight, the whole system essentially collapsed. The war for Tripoli and then COVID simply ensured that this collapse lasted until the end of 2020. That paradigm has now disintegrated. First of all, mobility has returned, as explained earlier, with the improving stability of the post-war period. And secondly, the potency of the law enforcement politics has waned. When it comes to the mobility, following the end of the war, there were two main developments. Firstly, internal travel became easier, both from Eastern Libya to Western Libya, but also in critical areas around Tripoli and the West Coast that had been divided by the war. Secondly, international travel to Libya became easier. As flights increased, paperwork became easier, and key restrictions were just dropped or eased. For example, the Egyptian government dropped restrictions on its own nationals from traveling to Libya in 2021. This jump started the revival of the hybrid smuggling model. On the failure of the politics of law enforcement, I don't have the time to really delve as deeply as this subject would merit. However, in a nutshell, the cynical power struggle between governments in the East and the West, and among factions in the West, has resulted in too many dirty deals, too many supposedly untouchable militiamen being elevated for the politics of law enforcement to really survive. Furthermore, there is no credible champion of this paradigm left. Fathi Bashaga, who was previously mostly associated among Libyan political figures with this drive to ramp up law enforcement, sided with the LAF along with Zawiyan militias, and in so doing embodies this collapse in the fight for crime as a political platform. This has led to a typically messy situation, albeit one that isn't entirely new in Libya. In 2022, the main bodies charged with fighting smuggling were often the most complicit in it. There is certainly a case of the LAF in Tobruk, with groups such as the TBZ and the Naval Special Forces in the lead here. There was less the case in the West in 2022, but the SSA coalition on the West Coast, as well, along with Mohammed Bahroun in particular, could also be accused of this, to mention a couple of examples. However, as a caveat, it's important to note that the type of smuggling that has been driven since 2020 is inherently less toxic than in some previous years. I characterized this earlier as hybrid migration, which again, I'll delve a little bit deeper. But briefly here, this is less toxic because it is less visible and is more contained, with migrants undertaking hybrid journeys, generally having less exposure to local communities in Libya. Furthermore, the collapse of overland routes from West Africa has also massively reduced the visibility of irregular migration through Libya, and also the level of abuse typically suffered by migrants undertaking the irregular journeys overland has, as a result, decreased. So what is hybrid smuggling? Migrants essentially involved in this type of smuggling, which is inherently transnational, enter Libya typically with regular visas arranged by a combination of travel agencies and smuggling networks that plan entire journeys from start to finish, from places as far afield as Dhaka, Abu Dhabi, Damascus, and Cairo. They travel regularly or semi-regularly within Libya, and then take boats to Europe, which is the irregular portion of their journey. Contrast this with overland trips undertaken in stages with no paperwork ever used, and smugglers arranging certain legs at most, but not having overarching control over the entire journey. Evidence of this pattern of smuggling can be found in some of the data points from recent years. For instance, the increased use of wooden boats, the growing average number of passengers on board, and in particular, the increased prevalence of migrants from relatively wealthier North African and non-African countries successfully arriving in Europe, especially Egyptians, Bangladeshis, Syrians, and Pakistani migrants. Together, Egyptians and Bangladeshis now constitute the majority of departures from Libya in 2022. This is up from 33% in 2021 and 29% in 2022, and just 7% in 2019. So here we saw an exponential growth at a very, very rapid rate, and which now has come to dominate the scene. These nationalities that undertake hybrid migration journeys, in contrast with the decline that we have seen in West African nationalities coming into Libya and traveling through Libya. Tobruk is another key development connected to the rise of hybrid smuggling. As I mentioned earlier, in 2022, 25% of sea crossings from Tobruk came from Tobruk. Effectively, all of these were migrants undertaking hybrid journeys. Why does this matter? It matters because this high-level type of transnational activity, where the smugglers operate outside of the country and manage to chart an entire journey across such a massive area and with detail inside Libya, brings us back to the kind of hybrid smuggling and sophisticated smuggling that had all but disappeared post-2017. So for this kind of smuggling to dominate, there are several factors that need to be in play, and one of them being collusion at a very high level with powerful Libyan players. While the year to date has been busier than the quiet years of 2018 to 2020, it has still been less busy than 2022. The main reason for this is that the Libyan Arab Armed Forces effectively shut down Tobruk departures with a security campaign that started in June. Does this mean that the politics of law enforcement has been revived? That might be optimistic. it's more likely that the LAF was signaling to international partners by both letting this happen in the first place and then shutting it down. In fact, the main effort to show commitments to law enforcement has come in the West with a series of airstrikes by the GNU in May and June on smuggler locations, among others. However, this too had political expedient reasons behind it, and for this reason must be sort of analyzed in its own context, and it's something that will be pursuing in our next publications. The airstrikes by the GNU did not have a major impact, and the West remains too politically divided for a joined-up action. But these efforts and the LAF policy in Tobruk are things to watch ahead for the summer of the 2024 season. I think I'll stop here and pass over to my colleague. Happy to pursue this further in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. We will surely continue to delve into these complex developments in Libya in the Q&A part. Now I'll hand over to Alice, who will talk to us about developments in Niger and Chad in relation to human smuggling and trafficking during 2022. Over to you, Alice.
Thank you, Tasnim. So I will start with Niger, and Claudia, if you could show the first map of human smuggling routes through Niger, thank you. So over the last year or so, human smuggling dynamics in Niger were characterized by really the consolidation of trends that have been underway since 2016. So following the criminalization and the collapse of the migrant smuggling economy in Agadez, which led most smugglers, or passeurs as they're known locally, to seek alternative activities. So most smuggling networks in Agadez, for instance, have reorganized to cater instead for the high demand for transport of Nigerian seasonal workers to Libya. So this activity, although it's less lucrative per passenger, the prices are much lower, it's also a much safer activity. And it provides a relatively constant and predictable client base for smugglers who can no longer transport foreign migrants. So that's one of the major sort of shifts that we've seen over the last few years. Many passeurs have also successfully reconverted to activities linked to gold mining. So either in gold mining itself, or providing transport to and from main hubs such as Agadez and Ahlit, or in auxiliary services and trade, supplying the gold fields. Another major alternative, or let's say shift, has been the transport of migrants to Algeria. So we've seen over the last 2 to 3 years a shift in movements of foreign migrants towards Algeria. So routes to Algeria have been significantly less impacted by the crackdown on human smuggling. Departures have surged, especially from places like Tawa, which is a major hub for transport to Algeria. And this is a hub that's really grown substantially in importance since 2019. Journeys to Algeria, although they're still very dangerous for migrants, they're increasingly popular, especially among Francophone migrants. And actually, what remains of the transport of foreign migrants to Libya now involves different routes altogether. So these are routes that have developed to dodge security measures by bypassing policed areas. And these routes venture more and more into dangerous territories, including areas on either side of the main road between Agadez and Dirkou. And these routes have led to numerous accidents and vehicle breakdowns, which are often fatal for migrants. Claudia, if you could show the next slide. So I've highlighted one of these routes on this map. So this is a route that connects the Nigerian border to the Libyan border. It bypasses all towns and main roads, and it uses an exchange point in a small town called Kohicontana. So this is to the east of Agadez. And at this exchange point, migrants have passed from one passer network to another. And this route is now one of the main itineraries used for the transport of foreign migrants. These operations are usually run by quite sophisticated smuggling networks that have representatives in Nigeria and Libya. The issue is that in addition to the risks of accidents and breakdowns, this route coincides with areas that are targeted by armed banditry. So that's another key trend that we've seen over the last few years, is that armed banditry has been posing a growing threat to human smuggling. It's been on the rise in the Agadez region since 2020. It's quite closely linked to the increasing presence of foreign armed groups in northern Niger and cross-border areas with Chad and Libya. But there also seems to be increasing attacks by local bandits. So these local actors are targeting the main road, so the road between Agadez and Dirkou, for instance, and attacks are taking place so much closer to cities and towns. And we're seeing an increase in attacks on individuals and smugglers traveling to Libya, even those who are traveling under the protection of the military convoy between Agadez and Dirkou. There have been several attacks that have targeted vehicles traveling with the convoy, including those of passers. So overall, what we've seen over the last 2 years in Niger is the contraction of human smuggling activities between Niger and Libya, while routes to Algeria have become significantly more popular among foreign migrants. We're also seeing a shift in routes to Libya that are being displaced to more remote and dangerous areas. Now, more recently, there have been some new developments that have impacted human smuggling dynamics. So, of course, the coup that took place at the end of July has had an impact. The main impact has been the closure of the borders with Benin and Nigeria. So this impact was felt most at the Benin border because Nigeria's borders had already been, for some border crossings, they were already partially closed before the coup. Whereas at the Benin border, the Manonville-Gaya bridge, which is a major entry point to Niger, and it's a really crucial border crossing for routes connecting West Africa to Niger and to North Africa. The closure of this border resulted in a huge uptick in human smuggling activities involving pirogues to cross the river. And our monitoring has also shown that there may have been a slight relaxation of law enforcement targeting human smuggling in Niger. This may facilitate departures and encourage the movement of migrants through the country. It's likely that this is the result of a shift in priorities for the transitional authorities. But there's also some expectation among passers in northern Niger that the CNSP might revise the 2015 anti-smuggling law. For now, there's no concrete indication that this will happen. And for now, the coup, although it has had an impact, it hasn't completely changed any of the dynamics that I outlined earlier. So the key trends that we've seen in 2022 remain pretty much the same. However, obviously, should the anti-smuggling law be changed in any way, this would have a huge impact on human smuggling in northern Niger, in particular in Agadez, where passers were the hardest hit by the crackdown. So, meanwhile, in Chad, human smuggling dynamics have also seen a significant contraction. So, next slide, please, Claudio. So in Chad, what's important to know is that most human smuggling activities in Chad actually involve northbound movements to the goldfields. So these activities of transporting people to the goldfields usually take place from from across the country, so that they can link eastern, western, and southern Chad to the north. And most of these movements involve smugglers, because travel to northern Chad has been mostly banned due to the perceived risk of Chadians joining rebel groups in the north and in southern Libya. So most people use the services of passeurs, and most people using these services are prospective gold miners. So they can be Chadian, but also foreign. There are also some individuals traveling further afield to Libya, and a few are foreign migrants who are aiming ultimately to travel to Europe. And so, but those numbers are quite low. I'd say the vast majority of people traveling to northern Chad are gold miners. These movements of prospective gold miners also bear significant risks of human trafficking. So we can maybe go further into this in the Q&A. But these movements are quite a good example of the blurred line between human smuggling and human trafficking. And actually, many gold miners travel on credit to the gold fields, and this makes them quite vulnerable to human trafficking. Since 2021, these human smuggling activities in Chad have been significantly impacted by additional restrictions on movements imposed by Chadian authorities in the wake of the FACT rebel group incursion in 2021 and the subsequent political crisis following the death of former President Deby. So though none have been as significant as the FACT incursion in 2021, and none have gone beyond the northern Chad area, there have been regular incursions by rebel groups in the far north of Chad. The latest involved the CCMSR and resulted in clashes with the Chadian army. So the threat from northern Chad is still quite significant, and this explains why restrictions have not been relaxed since 2021. These restrictions have mainly targeted hubs such as Mao and Moussouro, and also routes from the Kanem region towards towards northern Chad. The Kanem region has been associated with heightened risks of rebel recruitment, whereas on the other hand, routes from eastern Chad have enjoyed more freedom of movement, and in particular from the hub of Abishi. Another major upheaval that impacted human smuggling dynamics last year was the outbreak of intercommunal violence at the Kouribogudi goldfield in May, so May 2022. This resulted in the death of around 200 people. Following the clashes, the Chadian military closed the goldfield, evacuated the miners, and maintained a presence on the ground since. So most movements towards the goldfield were suspended. And then in September 2022, when the goldfield was officially reopened, within days, thousands of gold miners returned to the goldfield. And most of these arrivals were from Abishi. So really the dynamics in northern Chad, and in particular at the Kouribogudi goldfield, really play an important role in mobility patterns in Chad. And finally, to finish, obviously, recent months have seen the situation in Sudan impact mobility patterns in Chad. So since the outbreak of conflict in Sudan, Eastern Chad has seen a major surge in arrivals of Sudanese refugees and Chadian returnees, and this has put really strong pressure on already strained assistance capacities in Eastern Chad. And we've seen in recent months the movement of some people from Sudan who've entered eastern Chad, but then continued on to northern Chad and then to Libya, and some of them also moving further afield to Tunisia. So far, though, we haven't seen a huge arrival of Sudanese refugees to Niger. There could be a number of explanations for this, but possibly one of them is the difficulties that are already faced by Sudanese asylum seekers in Niger. So I will close there, but happy to answer any follow-up questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. So thanks very much to both of you for the very detailed and interesting insights that you have presented on these very complex developments. So we have got already some questions in the Q&A. So probably starting with the first question. So Anne asks, how do countries and donors better address the drivers of irregular migration and normalize reasonable levels of migration, creating a new win-win migration strategy and shutting down the criminal elements? Mark, would you like to start with this one?
Yes. First of all, proviso, it's a massive question that obviously requires a multi-layered answer that I can't give over here. However, I think it's obviously a very important, critical question. And I think based on what we saw over the years working in this field, we can start to give some solid answers on this. So I'll take as given the development and more long-sighted activity and engagement that should take place, as in some cases is taking place between the European Union, for instance, and the African Union, and development-focused activities. I'll talk more on the sort of medium-term level engagement that can be done. So I would say that after the Aegean crisis of 2015, in terms of the blueprint for medium-term border management and migration management deals that the European Union has done with several different entities and countries, I think the lessons learned from these deals have been mixed. There's been some successes, and which in large part have not been acknowledged, and there have been also failures. The failures have mostly come in the way of haste and lack of attention paid to the conflict potential of certain deals. I have in mind, for instance, the deal with Niger, which by and large, in terms of a migration management package, was successful in the sense that the economy around irregular migration in northern Niger collapsed pretty rapidly, and with it, the number of migrants flowing into Libya. The positive side of that, and again, I think this needs to be acknowledged because it's often not acknowledged enough, is that a very dangerous route into a very dangerous country where the international community and Libyan actors, good faith Libyan actors themselves, don't really have ample room to maneuver. Libyan detention centers have been a major human rights concern well before the Libyan revolution, and have continued to be so, perhaps in a more amplified way, well after the Libyan revolution. Same thing in urban areas. So what I'm saying is acknowledging that the disruption of a stream of people heading into this dangerous territory where we cannot really intervene, or we cannot really intervene effectively, is a positive thing. The negative thing is that with the collapse of human smuggling and trafficking in northern Niger, we also saw the major collapse of a major economy in this very impoverished region. And therefore, overnight, this whole region saw a major economic driver collapse. And I'm not just talking about people who were involved in the actual transport of migrants, which up to that point, up to 2015, before the law was introduced, was actually a legal activity, driving migrants right up to the border with Libya. But I'm also talking about the people who were involved in the ancillary work, hosting migrants, providing food and water to traveling migrants within the Agadez region, the broader Agadez region, etc., etc. By comparison, it's like expecting the German economy to cancel the automotive industry within the space of 6 months. That's what happened in northern Niger. And that obviously has consequences. And we have seen and reported those consequences in the spill into the disorganized and often dangerous territory and work of artisanal gold mining, which also has its own opportunities, but currently presents a lot of risks. And we've also seen a concurrent rise in banditry. But at the same time, as I said, there have been positives. We have seen these positives in Turkey. We have seen some of these positives in Libya, less so because it's a much more conflict-laden context, etc., etc. Where I feel we're lacking is with regard to the pursuit of criminals. So there we haven't really seen great progress. We have seen some steps in that direction. We have seen the sanctioning of human smugglers, for instance, in the Libyan context. We have seen some international law enforcement action, coordinated law enforcement action that has seen even some high-profile names being arrested. But the action there has been few and far between. And I think the opportunity for coordination of high-level international law enforcement there are huge opportunities that can be taken. But first, there needs to be a basis for an understanding between different states. And the second area where I think there are still big opportunities left on the table concerns alternatives to irregular migration. On paper, a lot of countries agree with these. So we've often spoken about legal pathways for economic migrants, for instance, coming to Europe because Europe actually needs the labor that many of these migrants want to offer, sometimes even on a seasonal or temporary basis, and even in respect to asylum seekers. The evacuation transit mechanism is not really working because it is jammed with queues in various different points, and we're yet to see a functional system for economic visas that would work. I think these are the avenues that are promising, and I really feel that work in these areas could have a significant impact on the medium-term management of irregular migration.
Thank you very much, Mark. Alice, is there anything you would like to add on this point? Okay, so moving on to the following question on the impact of COVID restrictions on human smuggling dynamics. I think, Mark, you touched upon this point in your presentation. So would either of you want to react to this question?
I think I'll leave it to Alice. COVID has had a particular story in the Sahelian region.
Yeah.
Alice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so basically the impact of COVID was quite significant in Niger because really the human smuggling had somewhat picked up in 2019. There had been like a relaxing of pressure on human smuggling as a result of pressure and tensions in the north, and so the government had sort of had relaxed law enforcement pressure on human smuggling, and it had actually started to pick up in 2019. So the COVID-19 border closures and travel restrictions had a really huge impact then, because it just completely cut short this increase in human smuggling. So there were travel restrictions both in the country, but also in the country of origin of migrants. And so really there was a decreased demand for human smuggling services. And also it made transporting people more risky and costly for smugglers. Overall, though, when these restrictions were lifted by, let's say, mid-2021, the situation more or less returned to normal, well, to the situation that we'd seen prior to 2020, except actually when like during 2020 and the beginning of 2021, and as a result of the COVID-19 travel restrictions, a lot of passeurs reconverted to the different activities that I mentioned earlier. So gold mining, even fuel smuggling, and for some also illicit activities such as drug trafficking. And actually those who did make that shift, we've seen that most of them have actually not really gone back to the transport of foreign migrants because the demand has remained low. So those are the main impacts that we saw in Niger. In Chad, it didn't really have as much of a significant impact.
Thank you, Alice. So moving on to the following question. So someone is asking, how do you think smugglers are advertising their services to potential migrants in these key countries, particularly where migrants wish to travel to Europe? Who would like to start with this question?
I can say a few words about that. Social media is obviously very big. Facebook is very big, and even like WhatsApp groups, so and Telegram and semi closed groups. The cat is obviously out of the bag when it comes to these technologies, and they're very important technologies for the dissemination of information. That said, I keep being surprised by how important word of mouth remains, and people receiving information from relatives or friends who have made the journey and have arrived home, etc., remains a key plank of the information dissemination. Unfortunately, very often this information dissemination is problematic, because migrants from various different contexts often have on their shoulders placed a lot of pressure to succeed, particularly in contexts where an entire family would have, for instance, pooled money to have a migrant travel to a foreign country and then earn money and then send remittances back home, and those remittances are funding a family or even an extended family in some cases. These migrants have tremendous pressure on their shoulders. Some of them are really young, and this pressure then translates itself into pressure to send distorted information back home that glosses over the challenges of the journey, that glosses over the challenges in the country of destination. So a migrant who is in Milan sharing an apartment with 15 other migrants, trying to do 2-3 jobs, being paid badly with very little conditions and hardly able to make ends meet, will rarely voluntarily telegraph that reality back home. more readily they will telegraph a reality that is much rosier, that tells of success and being able to make serious money and with that register success.
Sorry, thank you. Alice, do you have anything to add to this point?
No, I think that's overall the same dynamics that we're seeing, in the Sahel. Most of the migrants that we interview, most say that they made contact with their smuggler thanks to people who'd already made that same journey and who'd used that smugglers. So that seems to be a really key way of for smugglers to find new customers. Yeah.
Thank you, Alice. So we have a couple of questions on the coup in Niger. I'll try to blend them. So basically, I think this is a question for you, Alice. So basically, how do you think human smuggling and human trafficking in Niger will change after the coup? And how do you think, or to what extent do you think the EU or French response to the coup can have an impact on the human smuggling dynamics?
Sorry. So, I mean, right now it's obviously too early to tell for sure, what exactly will happen. Obviously, migration is one of the key topics of a cooperation between the EU and other states and Niger. It was also, one of the key policies that was actually implemented by the previous government in Niger. This cooperation and the crackdown on human smuggling that resulted from it created a lot of tension in the north, a lot of tension with local communities who resented the loss of livelihoods. So there is some expectation that the transitional authorities may seek to amend or change or reduce the anti-smuggling policies in Niger. This is also. So obviously, we're not sure right now, to what extent this cooperation with the EU will be hampered by, the change, the change in policies in Niger. I think what we are seeing now, a relaxation of law enforcement targeting human smuggling doesn't mean that it is a deliberate aim to reduce this pressure. For now, I think what we're seeing is the result of a shift in priorities. The military are busy elsewhere. They no longer really have an interest in spending a lot of resources in curbing human smuggling activities. But there have been signs over the last few weeks and couple of months that there's been meetings between local organizations from the Agadez region and the Minister of Justice around the possibility of a revision of the anti-smuggling law. So it is a possibility. If this does happen, and obviously it will depend, how, but if this does happen, the impact would be huge. Basically in Agadez, all the infrastructure is there. The passeurs who used to transport people prior to the criminalization of the transport of migrants. They are still there. They are some are still transporting the people. Others are involved in other activities, but it's quite possible that that sort of ecosystem could be reactivated, and we could quite easily see, a shift where human smuggling activities would restart from Agadez, and due to its location, and also the fact that that there is the routes between Agadez and Libya that used to be used are much safer than the ones that are used now. So we would see a shift back to these routes, and we'd see a shift back to Agadez, being a key hub. We could see also a shift of movements back to Libya, because the shift of the choice of Algeria rather than to Libya, that this was also the result of the difficulties faced by migrants to reach Libya. So we could also see, an increasing number of people traveling to Niger to seek travel to Libya. There's I think it is too early to tell what will happen, but this is the potential impact of a revision of the 2015 smuggling law, and a possible breakdown in the cooperation around migration with the EU.
Thank you very much, Alice. So moving on to another question, focusing on, just a second, on children. So how are children represented in the numbers, if we have that data, and what are the key risk factors for children in the different countries along the smuggling routes?
Unfortunately, we don't have data at hand, right now. It's a bit of a differing picture in different countries. One area of concern, for instance, has been Tunisia. I know it's not the subject of discussion today, but we have increasingly seen more unaccompanied minors coming out of Tunisia, and it's something that we are following. The risk factors depend on the different scenarios. So the risk factors for Tunisian unaccompanied minors, who are often strategically driven into the journey because of the underlying assumption, as happens in the Aegean, that minors will be given a softer sort of treatment in the recipient country, in this case Italy, and are maybe less likely to face deportation. In Libya, the risks are multiplied. So to this day, there are minors in Libyan detention centers where access of implementing partners is hit and miss, where minors can face abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, etc., and where their risk of these abuses, as well as risks of getting involved in human trafficking increase exponentially.
Thank you, Mark. So I think we are approaching the end of our event, so we'll take a couple more questions before we finish. So there is a question on potential Russian involvement in the smuggling of migrants from Niger and Libya. Do you have anything to say on that?
You want to go first, Alice?
Yes, I have no indication or have not seen any signs of any Russian involvement in human smuggling in Niger. Perhaps, Mark, you have something to add on Libya, but not for Niger in any case.
Yeah, no, same scenario. I have been asked about this a few times, mostly towards the beginning of the year when things really started to pick up in the east of Libya. There were rumors, and in some cases published rumors, I would insist, of Russian involvement in the increase in departures from the east. And even what I saw published speculated that this was a Russian strategy to pressure Italy or Europe in general. We have found no evidence whatsoever of this. Russia didn't really have a footprint in the areas that are important for embarkation around Tobruk, or even the broader coastal area. And when I say Russia, I mean Russia and or Wagner. So yeah, I won't say refute this information entirely, because you never know, but we found no shred of confirmation whatsoever.
Thank you very much, Mark. I think we finish on time. So thank you very much again to the speakers for the insightful comments, and thanks also for the participants. I would invite you to check the reports published by the Global Initiative. You find the links to the different reports published under this series in the chat bar.